answer session after the presentation to make a note of your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side. And at that session, you can also raise your hand. There's a hand in the top of your screen where you can raise your hand and then you can ask your question personally to the doctor. Kindly, when you do that, introduce yourself by your name and then your question. Keep your questions brief and to the point to ensure maximum participation and engagement. I'm going to introduce Dr. Shamley first. He's our in-house neurologist going to do the presentation, and he will be followed by Elsa Maroney, who's going to speak on BOPIA, and she will also have including a question and answer session after that. So before I introduce Dr. Shamley, I'd like to tell you that he's a solo practitioner. He's attached to a private clinic since 1998. He's presently at Wilgehevel Honeydew, Johannesburg, and with a special interest, including multiple sclerosis, in neurological infections, peripheral nerve disorders, and treating an extensive array of neurological disorders, including degenerative. Until recently, he's involved with the Mill Park Hospital Sleep Laboratory, and for over 30 years, he's the consultant neurologist at the Cerebral Palsy School in Brakpan, developing a knowledge of pediatric and developmental neurology. Welcome, Dr. Shamley, and thank you very much for being with us today. I will start your slide screen now.
Thank you, Non.
Okay.
Good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. My name is Desmond Shamley. I'm out in the West Rand of Johannesburg, for those of you who don't know where Honeydew is. We're going to talk today about just some shared decision-making in multiple sclerosis and what it means. As you all are aware, multiple sclerosis is a chronic disease, and it really presents management challenges both to the patient and to the medical practitioner. Firstly, it's an unpredictable disease, and what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other person. And it's important to remember that. And can I have the shared slide? Shared decision-making is really, it's a complex spectrum that encompasses both treatment, lifestyle, and environmental factors. Next slide. Okay, historically, many aspects of medical care and treatment has been paternalistic. That is, the doctor or the healthcare professional makes the decision, independent of the patient. And in South Africa, this view predominates, and still predominates to a large extent. You know, there's a saying in Afrikaans, die dokter is altyd reg. Next slide. Nowadays, there's a sweeping shift really towards patient engagement, and the patient engagement is a gold standard in ethical care. So, you know, just because the doctor says something doesn't mean you can't ask him questions or do your own research and then come to a decision. Next slide. All right. So there are two factors that are important when considering patient engagement. The first is how well does the patient with MS understand the disease and understand the treatment? And secondly, how can communication between the patient and the healthcare professional be improved? So those are the two important factors in shared decision-making. Next slide. All right, so in 2017, there was a request from the European Charcot Foundation. And just in case nobody knows who Charcot was, Jean-Marie Charcot was a neurologist working in Paris. He was born in 1825 and died in 1893. He worked at a hospital that's still going in the center of Paris called the Salpêtrière. And he's regarded as the father of neurology. And he, in the extract, was the first physician to describe the clinical features and the pathology that is found in multiple sclerosis. So what this committee wanted, there was a debate, because they got people together, they got patient advocates from various countries together, MS experts, and they wanted to discuss how to raise the awareness and to identify solutions to the issues of multiple sclerosis. And this group really, at the end of the meeting, they were committed to advancing shared decision-making, but it was also said they recognized there was a need for caution. And this was mainly on the basis of ethical grounds. Next slide. Next slide. No. All right. So what really came out of the meeting was that treatment requires informed consent. And that's an important aspect. So when the patient is suggested some treatment, they must consent to the treatment. Secondly, the patient sometimes one needs to discuss the risks, but some patients, often elect not to hear about treatment risks. And thirdly, the third concept that came out was that not all patients want the responsibility of being involved in their treatment or in any other health issues. The next slide. All right. And what the conference also found was that, or they found out that often the patients who'd had many more relapses are more interested in shared decision making, as they often perceive that the prior treatment hasn't worked for them, and they need to get more educated and more involved in decisions that take place. Okay, so what are the factors against patient engagement? The first is with the advent of social media, Facebook, internet, blogs, there has been an interest in patients becoming more and more involved. The next slide. But for 15 years into South Africa, there was really very limited treatment. Initially in South Africa, and it was only in the mid-90s that the interferons were released into the country. So only the first 3 agents were available, and really the results were some patients responded better to one than to the other. Some side effects were better, and other patients, their side effects were less. And it was only later, about maybe 7 years ago, that glutaramate acetate, also an injectable, known as Capaxone, was released into the country. So for 15 years, there were only the injectable agents, and they all had side effects, but everybody was different. Some people reacted better to the injectables than others. And I'm not certain which is the most popular one in South Africa, because they all arrived at different stages. But worldwide, if you look at worldwide, when only the injectables were available, the glutaramate acetate in extract had 50% of the market share. Next slide. So with advances in immunology and the study of what really is happening in multiple sclerosis, and it's taken many years to define, newer agents are available. And in extract, when one looks at this list, there are about 17 agents that are now available in Europe and in the USA. In South Africa, as South Africa is a very tiny market, a lot of these agents are not available, but more and more are becoming available in South Africa. Next slide. All right, so one of the main reasons against patient engagement is that it's unreasonable to expect every patient to fully understand all the aspects of treatment, and to understand the choice in terms of the efficacy, how good the various medications are, and how they act, the mechanism of action, and more important, the potential side effects of each of those on that 17 list. And even for neurologists, it's difficult to decide which of those 17 works better for which patient. And sadly, the other problem is that we've got all these tablets, but physicians cannot give each patient the time needed to fully explore and educate them on each option that is involved or before embarking upon new treatments. And all this information can often lead to a lot of confusion and anxiety in the patient. And that is one of the main factors against patient engagement. So although the responsibility lies with the patient, it is a problem. And as historically, physicians made choices on behalf of the patient's well-being. This has been typical for all branches of medicine. And however, there are many cases where patients are overwhelmed by the options available, and this leads to the confusion and anxiety. And this, however, this paternalistic approach where the doctor only makes the decision is not compatible with this shared decision-making. Another aspect against patient engagement is that often the patients are looking for short-term answers, whereas the medication in MS really is a long-term, it's a long-term scenario. One's got to look at long-term, because what one wants to do in MS is to prevent the long-term complications. And it's also it's important also for the patient to remember that with MS, one's got to just accept a life of pharmaceutical therapy, because initially when I started neurology, it said, well, you only have to take this medicine until you're about the age of 60, and then it was the age of 70, and now even if you stop it at 70, you still got the possibility of having relapses later on. And one of the major problems is in favor of patient, well, one of the major drawbacks is that it is the responsibility of the physician to make a decision. So often the patient has to sort of trust the doctor, you know, but one's got to, there's two things involved. So the reason for patient engagement is that they say it's the blockbuster drug of the 21st century. And one needs to wonder why. And what has been found is that the more patients get involved, there's better adherence to treatment. And as a result, it decreases your mortality rates. And it also leads to reduced healthcare consumption. You know, because once you start using the medication regularly, you don't skip it, you adhere to treatment, your relapse rate is definitely less. And one must also look at other aspects of lifestyle, naturally. And so if the neurologist wants patients to adhere to treatment, he needs to give them some ability on how best to manage their disease. And the patients need to develop capacity and become responsible for their choices. Next slide. Next slide. And what's also important about patient engagement, there was a study done in Europe over a 2-year period, and where they monitored patients, and about 30% of patients discontinued treatment. And the patients who discontinued treatment said, well, they felt they had no decision in the clinical decision making. They lacked the understanding of the condition. And they also lacked realistic expectations of what to expect with this chronic condition. Next slide. Yeah, so what it was, we found that patients who became more involved, they felt they feel a sense of responsibility for the management of their condition, which then translates into better satisfaction and better adherence and improved incomes. And this whole concept of patient engagement actually started with the diabetic patients, because patients with diabetes, for the last 8 to 9 years, there's been much more stricter control of sugars. Patients are more involved, getting 3 times a day insulin, monitoring their blood sugars much more carefully. And once the patient gets involved, it's a challenge to keep the sugars under control. All right, so next slide. All right, so one's got to find the correct balance between this paternalistic approach and assisting the patient to become more in charge of their treatment. So the patients need to be educated. They need so that they can make informed decisions, and they should have a knowledge of what risks are involved with the treatment. And the problem is there's a risk. There's lots of information available online, but some of the information is misleading and dangerous. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay. So there are quite a few websites that one can visit to get information. The MSSA has got a nice website. I've just listed 4 websites here, but there are many more. There's the Multiple Sclerosis of Australia. They've got a good website, as well as the MS Society of the United Kingdom. And then if you want an American website, the Mayo Clinic organization has a good website and some good information on multiple sclerosis. And next website. Next slide. All right, there's some. I was looking at some blogs, and it's always difficult to know which blogs to read. And I saw on Google there was the 20 or the 50 best blogs on multiple sclerosis, and I read some of these blogs, and there was one here called MS Bites. It's written by a dietitian, and she gives sensible information on diets in MS. She doesn't do any unusual diets. Her big thing is, of course, is to avoid what they call trans fats. These are bad fats, and that's like fats that are made from liquid oil, which then becomes solidified. And you usually find this in like margarine, and often these fast food chains use the same type of oils to make their fried foods, like chips and French fries and fried chicken, etc. So one should really try and avoid these trans fats, which are just unhealthy generally. But I mean, I had a patient recently who I hadn't seen for about 6 years, and when I first saw her, she weighed about 80 kilograms, and she's now down to about 35 kilograms. And what she would do 2 or 3 times a year was go on a 40-day fast of just drinking water. I don't know where she found this diet, and she only used to drink a maximum of 2 liters of water a day and nothing else. I don't know how she did it, but she managed. But she lost a tremendous amount of weight. And I think what the concept behind that is, by going on these very stringent fasts, it increases your body's natural cortisol, and so it can, I suppose, help the inflammatory process or the inflammation that's present in the brain. But I think they are also dangerous, and it's not for everybody. I mean, anyway, another blog which is quite interesting is it's called the MS blog. It's an English blog from the Barts Medical School, and they've got some medical information, immunology, and they discuss therapies. And it's quite a good a blog to get hold of. In actually, the guy who runs the Barts Institute is an ex-South African, Dr. Jeb Vanini, comes out quite often to South Africa as his mother still stays in Johannesburg. All right. Next slide. But the other aspect of patient involvement is also not to forget about your general health. You know, one must have blood pressure checks once or twice a year by your family doctor. In females, particularly females who are postmenopausal or even before, should have tests for osteoporosis, bone density tests, mammograms and pap smears mustn't be forgotten about. And in males, you know, they should have just make certain about other health issues that like prostate and other aspects that other illnesses that can occur. One mustn't always just write down everything to multiple sclerosis. The next slide. So it's important to remember that you know, medicine is not a pure science, right? It really relies on clinical evidence, and this evidence is ongoing. You know, these new medications come out, new data comes out, new indications come out, and all this information has to be analyzed. And one could see this now with the COVID epidemic, where, you know, every few weeks there was sort of new information and new treatments, and people didn't know how to treat COVID initially, and all unusual treatments were suggested on the social medias. But slowly, you know, people have got understand that it's a virus. It can in some people cause serious damage, and the mortality rate is increased. As it is in South Africa, we've already got I don't know how many deaths already, which is quite astounding. So, you know, and particularly so with all these newer medications, there are newer indications, new data has to be continually analyzed. As you know, a drug comes onto the market, initially, you know, they did a study of 1,000 people or 2,000 people, but then as it starts getting used with other people, you know, other side effects may become evident. Next slide. So the important thing is when you go and see your doctor, one must, you know, you got to try and form a positive relationship with the neurologist. But this doesn't just occur on the first visit; it occurs after a number of visits. You know, he gets to know you, and you get to know him better, so that you can have this relationship that develops. And you must you know, plan your appointments quite appropriately, you know. And when you do go and see him, you must avoid giving irrelevant information. You know, he's not interested if you've won the lotto of 20 million. You know, he wants to know about the multiple sclerosis, your multiple sclerosis symptoms, and any other symptoms that are concerning you. And I always say it's a good suggestion to write notes down. Have an agenda of what you want to discuss before you walk in. And then don't say that you've forgotten the agenda at home. You've made notes but forgot it at home. You could even send an email a few days before the time to the practice so that he's got that on hand about your issues and concerns that you want to discuss. In actual fact, there was a study done, I think, from Spain, where they looked at patients with MS who go to their doctors, and they found that if the person starts asking a question or telling them about symptoms, if it lasts more than 40 seconds, the doctor usually starts chipping in. Doctor starts chipping in because he just can't listen to 3 minutes of questions at once. So the questions must be short. Next slide. Well, before we get to the end, I just want to say it's important to develop this trusting relationship. So shared decision-making is an important part of patient engagement. And the success relies on an effective patient and doctor relationship. So what is important to the neurologist is not always important to the patient and vice versa. However, shared decision-making is the correct option for every patient. Once communication and the engagement doesn't only have to be with the neurologist, it can be with the physiotherapist, occupational therapist, or the MS nurse, for instance. I think that's important. And that's all I have to say about shared patient making. Thank you, and thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, I'll try and answer them. All right, the first question that's been typed says, is there progression of relapsing, remitting MS without relapses? It's an interesting concept because during the lockdown, there were lots of Zoom meetings, and some people feel that from the beginning, MS could be regarded as progressive, but you have these relapses in between. So is there progression of relapsing, remitting multiple sclerosis without relapses? It's a difficult question because you can get silent relapses, particularly when one looks on the MRI scan of the brain. You can get some new lesions developing, and that would mean progression of the illness. But they might be in a silent part of the brain without the person knowing it.
There's a second question that says, you list HSCT as an MS treatment. When would you consider this as an option for your patient?
At the moment, I very rarely consider this as an option because it's not registered as treatment options in South Africa. So the medical insurances don't pay for it. And one has to sponsor it yourself. And this is the big problem. But when does one, I think, in actual fact, I would probably consider it less and less nowadays, particularly as there's one or two newer agents out, alemtuzumab, for instance. So I would have, if you're having very active MS, then I would consider the bone marrow transplant, all right? But otherwise, I wouldn't. But nowadays, you've got alemtuzumab, which isn't as toxic as the bone marrow transplant. In actual, over many years, I've only sent about five people who have asked me to refer them for bone marrow transplants, and there wasn't one that's really improved. There have been a few patients with one or two of the other doctors that have that have found improvement, but it's not really recommended treatment.
Thank you, doctor. There's another question. How can you tell if medication is not working for you, specifically if you are not having obvious relapses?
Well, I think the way you can tell is by doing an MRI scan. And that's why nowadays people are doing more and more MRIs. They're doing them maybe once a year. Medical aids allow you to do an MRI with contrast to see if there are new spots. And if you are having new lesions, then one could consider that this medication's not working.
Yeah. There's a question with a brand name. Would you suggest Tubigen to help with fatigue and cognitive ability?
Well, again, you see, the fatigue and cognitive ability occurs with advanced, usually with MS that is a bit more advanced. And is it as a result of all the white matter lesions that have caused the cognitive ability? It's difficult to know.
I'm sorry, doctor, to interrupt you. She corrected her question and she said she's sorry, it wasn't supposed to be Tuvagen. She's asking about Provigil.
Provigil.
Provigil, okay. That makes it better.
Okay, Provigil is a stimulant. It's a stimulant very similar to Ritalin. It was registered for narcolepsy. It does help with concentration. But I think that, you know, I would rather use a Provigil is very expensive. But I see there's now a generic of Provigil on the market. It's just been released about a week ago, and it's about 900 rand a month. But I think if one wants to try some stimulant to try and improve your cognitive ability, maybe something like methylphenidate that the kids use for concentration at school might be a cheaper option. And only if you have side effects from the methylphenidate, then I would perhaps use Provigil.
Oh, thank you. We are going to go to Janine Alexander Thomas next. She says, have you ever seen a lesion go away, like remyelination? Has it ever happened to your knowledge? This is a newly diagnosed patient.
It's interesting. Yes, you can, lesions do disappear. And I have seen that on scans where you've seen patients come in, particularly if the lesion was caught early on, was the lesions are from inflammation. Well, you get initially in the lesion, you get lots of inflammation. And if you can treat that inflammation before injury occurs to surrounding brain tissues, you will see it disappear after a few months. But it's not usual, but you've got to treat that lesion early on. And that's why they tend to use high dose steroids if you are having a relapse. But I've seen quite a few patients, when you do the scan, let's say 6 months or a year later, 1 or 2 of the spots have disappeared completely. But there might be new ones that have developed. And that's the problem.
Interesting. Teresa Fourie has put her hand up to pose a question. Teresa, could you unmute yourself and ask your question? Teresa Fourie?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning, doctor.
Yes.
I would like to ask you, I was on rebirth for 6 months, but in that 6 months, I had 2 relapses. I started my first Aubagio last night. I drank the first Aubagio last night. How long does it take before you can actually say that the side effects of this treatment start?
That's difficult to know, but you can, you know, with the Aubagio, initially you can get sort of a running tummy, you know, loose stools, sometimes diarrhea, and sometimes you can get thinning of your hair. Those are the 2 major side effects. You can also get some liver dysfunction, but that's because you only really see that on blood tests. But they can occur within 2 days, or of the diarrhea can start within a day or 2 of taking the medication.
Okay, so if I take the medication for like a week and I don't have these side effects, can I assume that I'm not going to have them?
Yeah, you know, side effects only occur in a very small percentage of patients. They don't occur in everybody. You know, I had, and if you do get some diarrhea, I've had it in a few patients. We just give them an Imodium tablet or to take every day. And within a month, we stop the Imodium and it's gone. And if your hair does start thinning or falling out, I can assure you within 6 months, your hair will be back to normal. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And then I would just like to ask you, my vision I don't have very good vision. I went to see an eye specialist, but they checked out all the nerves behind my eye and they were all fine. Can I assume, or can I ask that if I have a lot of pain, it feels as if my vision is worse than when I don't have pain? Is it the lesions causing the vision problem?
It's very difficult to answer that question because if you've got pain in the eye itself or movement of the eye, it means there might be some inflammation of the optic nerve. Some active inflammation of the nerve, because you shouldn't get visual problems.
Okay.
You shouldn't get pain, with visual problems. The MS lesions that occur in the brain, when they do, they would be more permanent. They wouldn't come and go.
Okay, yes, because I do have the lesions in the brain. So because my optic nerve, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
And it's fine. So when my eyesight goes like blurry or bad, then I experience pain at the same time. So then that's why I connected the two to each other.
No. If it's from lesions in the brain, you shouldn't get pain in your eye. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, doctor.
Yep. All right,
We've got two more questions, doctor. The one is from a guest asking George Contos. He says, Ocrevus was suggested for me, but it has not been approved by medical aid. Do you think they will approve it, or what does the future hold?
George, I think the problem with Ocrevus is that I only know one medical aid so far that is paying for it, and it is a new agent, and so a lot of the medical aids haven't decided whether they will pay for it. But when you look at the cost of Ocrevus versus the cost of the interferons over a 6-month period, it's basically the same, maybe a little bit more. And for people who don't know, Ocrevus is an injectable agent, but you only get, it's a drip you get. You get a drip on day 1 and on day 14, and then you don't take any medication for 6 months. And so I'm not too sure which medical aid you're on, but often the medical aid want you to be on the higher plan before they pay for it. But I think they will start realizing that it's a very good agent. It's really a good agent, and it's a new concept in treating MS, because most of the interferons used to go and treat the T cell pathway, and this is now treating B cells as well as some T cells. So it is treating both components of the immune system. All right. Sorry, I haven't got more answers for you on that with regard to the medical aid.
Thank you, doctor. Then Annabelle Oosthuizen is asking a question about Tuvagen in general. She moved from Avonex to Tuvagen in 2018 and then had massive and repetitive relapse. Since being on Tuvagen, she still has active relapses with a new active lesion in April of this year. What do you think about Ocrevus?
You see, she's not responding to Tuvagen, and I've had 1 or 2 patients, in actual fact, where I've stopped Tuvagen because I've had, in actual fact, 3 patients where we discontinued Tuvagen because they continue to have relapses. So although it is a good agent, and I use it quite in a number of patients, and a lot of them have been quite stable on Tuvagen, it's not, as I said right in the beginning, what works for one person doesn't always work for the other. So I think because you're still having relapses on Tuvagen, I suppose one should, in actual fact, consider a change of agent. And I suppose Ocrevus is the way to go, because it does attack a different part of the immune system, which none of the other agents have done before. And I've got 2 patients on Ocrevus, and none of them so far have had any complications.
Thank you, doctor.
Yeah.
It seems like no, there's something more. Sorry, it came in. Sunmarie is asking, is Ocrevus available in South Africa, and does anyone know the costing that? I can't find any info on Google. I think you've just about answered that question.
Yeah, it is available, and it's available, I think the company is called Roche, but your neurologist should know about it.
Yes.
And the cost is just a little bit more than a 6-month supply of the interferons.
Yeah. Then Raisa is asking about Tysabri, the long-term effects.
Well, that's a difficult one. Tysabri it's also the natalizumab is the chemical name. It's been used. It's again, if you've got active MS, people are using it quite frequently, but you've got to monitor it quite carefully because there is a small risk of developing something called PML, or progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy. But your doctor will check for that. There's a certain virus called the JC virus, which actually stands for John Christie, which in actual fact, a lot of people have got this virus in their system. And Tysabri has got a rare side effect of reactivating this virus, which can have devastating effects if it's not caught in time. But that's the major long-term effect of Tysabri, is this reactivation of this virus, called the JC virus. Thank you.
Doctor, there's a last question, a very interesting one. What are government hospitals prescribing?
Okay, they only, at the moment, I know in Gauteng, I don't know about the other provinces, but in Gauteng, they allow them, they only use the interferons at present. And they only allow, I don't know what the figure is, 30 patients or 50 patients a year that you get the interferons. I know they use Avenex or what are they, or the interferons, but that's the only one that they're using at the moment.
Interesting. I do hope it's going to change when we change the guidelines.
See, apart from the guidelines, you see, I think the major problem at the moment is we don't have a definite figure of the number of patients of MS in the country. Mm. And this is a big problem. And I was actually thinking of maybe as a project, trying to get some sort of register of all the MS patients in the country. And then, because what happened for instance, in Egypt at the moment, in Egypt, the National Health pays for all these medications. And in extract in Egypt, Ocrevus is like is a second line agent. And it's paid for by the government, because what happened was there was one of the professors there, did a whole survey of every patient with MS, and they had all the details. And they went to the Department of Health there, and they said to them, we've got so many patients with MS, we've got to do something about it. And eventually got them to pay for fancy tablets in Egypt. So, and I think this is the big problem in South Africa. We don't have a register of all the different patients.
Yeah, true.
Yes.
I would love to do that project with the pharmaceutical companies to back us up
We
financially.
do it without the pharmaceutical company. That is the big problem, yes. And that is the big problem. They want it without the pharmaceutical companies. It's got to be done for one of the universities, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. That's even better. So then it's very impartial then.
Yes, impartial. That's the thing.
Yes, great.
Thank you.
I see our Roy has got his hand up. Roy, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question? This is our last question. Roy and Lynn, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question now? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Is there any drug for chronic progressive MS yet?
Okay, so you see, chronic progressive, it's really is secondary progressive MS, because most MS starts off slowly and then progresses. And in actual fact, Ocrevus is registered for chronic MS, and there's a new drug coming out from Novartis, also been registered for chronic MS or for secondary progressive MS. It will be released in the next few months.
Oh, good.
On that list,
Thank you.
I put that down on the list. It's the one with the S. I just can't remember how to pronounce it. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. I think that's the end of the
Of the
questions,
Thank
Doctor.
No, thank you.
Dr.
you very much
Shamley,
for
thank you
inviting
very much. We appreciate your excellent presenting and time spent with us, and we wish you a pleasant afternoon.
Thank you very much. Yes, we're going to watch the rugby.
Okay, cool. Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Keep well. Ta-da. Next up, we have there you go, Elsa Maroney. Elsa Maroney is going to talk about POPIA and what that means for you. Elsa Maroney is an admitted attorney and practiced law until she joined the medical industry 8 years ago. She's been the compliance officer at Abbott Laboratories for 4.5 years, and then she moved to a commercial side before joining Merck in 2020. Elsa's role focuses on compliance and data privacy. POPIA has been a great focus for her this past year, as well as all other data privacy laws globally. Welcome, Elsa.
Thank you very much, Nan, and good morning to everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm really excited to discuss this with you because I know we all are focused on POPI or POPIA, and we all want to know more because what do we need to do if we get that call from that agency again or that call center, asking if they can buy, provide something to us or sell something to us. So I'm going to share my screen and then we're going to get going.
Thank you.
Okay, so what is today's agenda? We're firstly going to look at why is POPIA so important, and I'll definitely watch the time. We all want to go and watch that rugby. I don't want to let Doctor not attend that. And then we're going to look at the POPIA top 10 facts. We're going to spend time on the key definitions and then POPIA compliance as well as key takeaways. So please feel free at any time to stop me and ask a question. So why is POPIA so important to us and to you specifically as a patient? So first I want to introduce to you the information regulator, and I do motivate you to go and look at their Facebook pages, their website. This is a very, very active, how can I say, authority or regulator in our country. They really focus on, the rights of the data subjects, which is you and me, and they really go out to focus in, and they also do a lot of campaigns, and they actually travel right through the country, visit places in order to educate people on POPIA, because although this act was brought out in 2013, yes, we've learned along the way and we implemented a lot of stuff, but not a lot of people are actually aware of what's your rights and what is the obligations and the things that need to happen in terms of this law. So please feel free, go to their website, go to their Facebook page. It's absolutely worth it. They also do provide free webinars, and where they specifically focus on us as data subjects. So do yourself a favor and go and do that. So let's start with practical examples, because if it's not practical, it's not going to speak to our hearts and we're not going to listen. So I don't know if you can remember last year, September, this terrible hack happened with the huge Experian, and it was a huge data breach. They said, or they estimated, was 24 million people was exposed to online fraudsters, potentially, because they had access to all these people, because it's a credit bureau, they had access to a lot of people's details. So what the information regulators chair then very, very quickly responded out. She said, our investigation will review absolutely everything around this investigation. We will not let this go. Please feel free. There's a link to this article if you want to read more on this. Another practical example, and this actually happened a long time ago, February, more or less January, February 2018. And this was regarding the late King Goodwill Zwelithini's leaked MyWay clip. So what the MyWay call center agent did, he phoned him, and then he obviously wanted to sell insurance to him. And what the information regulator at that time also commented on, because remember, as soon as the law was created in 2013, that also gave the government the opportunity to make sure that the information regulator gets established, etc. So they have been operating now quite for a while, and they actually also commented on this, and it was very clear that MyWay actually violated the Protection of Personal Information Act, and the information regulator obviously is mandated to enforce compliance, and they also then commented on this. And there was a tweet on this, and they estimated that they would definitely, at that stage, if Popia was in full compliance, they would have been in breach of it, and they would have paid a big fine. So what the CEO of MyWay then did is he phoned him, and he actually did apologize. So luckily that ended very well. Then, not so long ago, Nedbank also had a data breach, and there was also a tweet, Business Times Online, and they actually estimated also that more or less 220 billion from US consumers in the US in 2018. So if Popia was also active at that time, Nedbank will definitely would have been fined as well. So now last year, Popia came into full effect and enforcement from the 1st of July. So that means that enforcement started this year. So the government gave us a year grace period to make sure that we prepare ourselves, especially for companies. There was quite a lot of things that we had to do. But with the WhatsApp privacy policy that went around in the beginning of the year. I don't know if you can recall it. I mean, WhatsApp asked you to consent, and the information regulator actually went through the privacy policy, and they were not happy or impressed. And they said that in their view, WhatsApp is actually in contravention of our Popia law, and they had to actually, from WhatsApp's side, actually had to contact the information regulator and obtained special how can I say, approval to do it this way. But the information regulator wouldn't have just given them approval, because it's definitely in breach of our Popia Act. So WhatsApp didn't respond at that stage, and they were not very happy. And they actually vowed in May that they will definitely take this further, and they will actually approach the World Data Privacy Regulator in terms of this matter. So information regulator is definitely involved, and they do respond very, very quickly on matters like this. So I don't know if you've noticed, if you belong to Discovery, you would have also received this notification where Discovery will also no longer provide you with an email that contains your personal information. So everything will be encrypted, which means a password will be required. So they will now have their, on the app, you'll be able to go to a secure inbox, and there you'll be able to view your documents with your personal information. So this is just one example how big companies actually prepared for POPIA and made sure that they're in compliance. So a next question then arose the past few months is, what's going to happen with court proceedings in terms of POPIA litigation? I mean, it's very it's sure, it's definite, there's going to be cases in court, and people are going to say, but I'm not going to disclose certain information because it's POPIA protected. So this was a very interesting case where the applicant actually had an application to sue this company because she injured herself while visiting this company. And then the other party requested her medical records. And then her attorneys, and then after she, as well as Ms. Gordon, then actually rejected providing her medical records. Because as you all know, medical information is a special type of information in terms of POPIA Act. And she said, well, this is infringe on my right to dignity and privacy under POPIA. So this had a very interesting response from the court. And the court actually rejected her argument by saying, yes, you have a right in terms of POPIA, but it's also limited in circumstances. I mean, this is a 7 million claim as a result of injuries. So in this case, she is supposed to provide this medical information to the party so that they can assess it. So the court found that Ms. Gordon's medical practitioners are responsible and has an obligation to deliver this medical records. So very interesting. And I think we'll have to have a look out for future how things are going to evolve in the courts regarding POPIA. But yes, our personal information is protected, but there's also limited circumstances. So I think we can all agree we need to take this seriously. There's definitely risks and liabilities for you, me, as data subjects, as patients, as employees. And we need to be very careful, and we need to be aware of certain things. And I think it's important that we start with, we need to make sure that things like our data footprint, every information that you receive, and then what you transmit, we need to then know that as soon as we forward information that contains personal information, we actually starting to become a contracting party in terms of POPIA. We need to make sure that everything that we do on social media, what we provide on social media, it's not your personal information, because you know what, that just exposes yourself unnecessary. So please make sure that you're careful when you disclose personal information, and especially if we receive those calls from banks. I think we're very familiar with those calls that they might ask you your password, etc. Yes, we need to be very careful. But I mean, hacking becomes now next level. They only require certain parts of your personal information, and they'll be able to then from that get other personal information. So please be careful so that you don't expose yourself to hacking risks, identity theft, or any other cyber crimes. So as soon as you receive other people's personal information, then you also become bound by the duties under POPIA. So personally, please be aware that you don't have a lack of awareness and vigilance. I mean, we all are still faced with hybrid ways of working. So we make use of online and working remotely we're dependent on it. So because we're working remote, it potentially increases data risk. And also we rely so much on digital tools, etc. So please be careful, and also be careful when you do social interactions online, because this happens more and more and more. And then very interesting, government is also using internet for communication more. So that all is increased risk of data breaches and cyber attacks. So for businesses, it's also a big risk because law is national, but markets are global. It's so easy and quickly by press of a button that information goes cross-border. We need to obtain special approval from the information regulator if we're going to transfer employees or even patients, healthcare professionals' data cross-border. And the requirement there is we need to make sure that our that country that we cross-border the information, their laws is just as strong as ours. So there's quite a few things that we need to look out before we can transfer your information cross-border. But please, as a patient, as a data subject, make sure and keep people accountable and ask the question, but do you have the approval, or no, you don't have my consent to use my information or transfer it? I think a good habit is by starting to everybody that phones you and want to sell something to you, where did you get my data? Because I think before POPIA came in and is enforced, they actually took a lot of chances, and they made as much as possible calls in order to get that business that they could before it was fully enforced. And it's all about the data. Nowadays, you don't ask, show me the money. You actually ask, show me the data. So why is it so important? Data is the most valuable asset. Facebook. It's not their software connecting people, but the data of the users it connects. Uber. They don't own a single taxi. Their most valuable asset is the data of people who use it. Google. Their primary asset is the index that takes customers to their desired websites. So, how many volumes of data are communicated globally a day? Well, this is the stats, just to mention a few. 320 billion emails, 500 billion tweets, 95 million photos and videos are shared on Instagram, 65 billion WhatsApp messages sent, 16 million text messages sent. I'm surprised it's still so much. And then 350 million photos shared on Facebook. Okay, is there any questions so far? Okay, so let's move forward. So I would like to share with you the top 10 facts from POPIA. So POPIA took effect on the 1st of July 2020, but enforcement only started this year, the 1st of July. So what does that mean? Yes, POPIA was in full effect. Everything did apply, but the enforcement, so for the regulator to issue a fine, for example, that started since the 1st of July. So companies had to rush and make sure that their company is fully POPIA compliant. And POPIA actually applies to any company or organization processing personal information in South Africa. I mean, and to start off, it's actually any company, because any company's got employees and they process employees' information. So, and this South African company must be in the country itself. And even if they're making use of automated or non-automated means of processing in the country. So if it happens in South Africa, it's part of POPIA. So fines for non-compliance with POPIA can range up to 10 million rands. The transfer of personal information outside of South Africa is prohibited by POPIA with exceptions. And as I mentioned, we need to actually obtain approval from the information regulator that we transfer personal data. Especially if we, let's say, we take children and we do a study on them, that information, and let's say we transfer it to Kenya or to Germany, the information regulator then take this application and then they consider, okay, what's the laws in Kenya? Is it as strong as POPIA? Yes or no? Okay, maybe Germany will be easier because they've got GDPR, etc. So it's a very, very important step to be POPIA compliant is to obtain that approval. And then POPIA creates 9 actionable rights for South African citizens. And this citizens, you and me, are called data subjects in terms of the law. So we have the right to access, right to correction, and right to deletion. And please remember that you have the fullest right that if a company do have your information, to actually make an inquiry and ask them, is my information correct? Okay, I don't want you to use my information further, so please delete it, etc. You are in full right to do that. Further, POPIA creates 8 conditions for lawful processing in which you, the data subjects, consent is essential. So it's up to websites, companies, and organizations, so everybody else is called the responsible parties, to prove that their processing is lawful. So that means if we need to prove that we're processing your information as data subject, we need to prove that we have obtained your consent and we actually lawfully processing your information. POPIA defines consents as voluntary, specific, and informed expression of will. And then POPIA defines processing as quite a lot of things. If you think that collection, receipt, recording, organization, storage, merging, linking, and more is so wide. But if the time allows, we will actually go into more detail into those different types of processing. And then POPIA defines personal information broadly as any information relating to not only a living person, but also a company or a legal entity. And I must say that's very unique to POPIA compared to other data privacy laws in the globally. They don't include both. So for us, companies and a living person. So it's important that we do get consent even to process companies' information. Now, all those CRPC documents or anything that they provide in order to become vendors, etc., we need to get the consent. Very, very important. And then a very interesting one is that somebody deceased for 20 years or less, their personal information is also defined and still protected. So PIA is the Promotion of Access of Information Act. So you have the POPIA law and you have the PIA law on the other hand. So yes, you have a right for your personal information to be protected, but then we as South Africans also have the right of access to information. So it's literally weighing up the one right with the other. So very important in terms of PIA, yes, you have the right to access certain information, but then PIA also have requirements that you need to fulfill. So there's steps that you need to do. So very interesting how the legislator actually requires us to have POPIA on the one end and PIA on the other. So we had to update policies, procedures in terms of POPIA. But each company, for example, needs to have a PIA manual where we actually direct data subjects to obtain approval to access the information. So let's say you want to find out about a certain company or the information that they have of you. There's a certain procedure that you need to follow in terms of PIA. And then you can do that at any time. And the information regulator also then requires each company to have a information officer. So by default, an information officer is the CEO. So they were also very smart in terms of that, because if you're not going to make your CEO or your MD responsible, they're not going to have a big focus on laws like this. So CEO and a managing director can then assign their responsibilities and all the practical things that need to be implemented to the deputy information officer. So for example, in terms of South Africa, I'm the deputy information officer, where our CEO or managing director is the data privacy officer. So all those obligations and rights and everything that I need to do to make sure that we're POPI compliant is assigned to me. So let's say you want to assess information that we as a company have, then you'll follow our PIA manual, which any company needs to provide to you at any time, and then you follow the process in it to get your personal information. 2 weeks ago, the information regulator did also issue more information on what's the fees, etc. So that's also quite a very interesting update in the past 2 weeks regarding POPI and PIA. So you can approach a data privacy officer or information officer or deputy officer at any time by asking what information do they have of you, and if you can assess it and see if it's correct. And then POPIA allows companies and organizations to process data if it's deemed in the user's legitimate interest, creating a point of ambiguity for possible and enforcement difficulties. And like I mentioned with the court case, so when do you have a legitimate interest? So for example, we have a legitimate interest to, for example, process a company's information to provide them with an invoice or a quote. So this is going to be very interesting how the court is going to determine that legitimate interest in court cases. But I mean, we've seen now with this one with Ms. Gordon, the court actually asked her to provide that information. Okay, so key definitions, and it's quite important because you as a data subject is the most important of this POPIA legislation. So you are the person, the data subject to whom the information relates. The responsible party is the company or private or public body or any other person alone in conjunction with others determines the purpose and means for processing your personal information. So let's say we can, as a responsible party, then also appoint an operator that work with us to process your information. And the operators then under the direct authority of the responsible party. So a typical example is when you can access a website. You'll go in and first of all, they'll ask you if you accept all the cookies and you say accept, okay, and you go in. Then they always will have a link to the privacy statement or the privacy policy. You'll link on it. And then in that policy, it will actually tell you which cookies are used, which analytics are used, etc. But they will also, now that company that hosts that website on behalf of another company, let's say company A wants a website, but obviously it's not they can't create websites, they are selling a certain product. Then another company B is the operator and they create the website on their behalf. So both parties then at the end are fully responsible for your data. So the operator can't say, okay, sorry, not my problem, it's the responsible party's issue. No, both parties are responsible because the operator also has access to all that information. So if you access a website and let's say you want to register for a webinar, for example, you're going to give your name, your surname, your email address, and all of that are considered as personal information. So both parties are responsible. And then, as mentioned, the information regulator is established and is also the protector, and it's their job to also educate us as data subjects on these matters. So public record is a very, very interesting definition because the Act refers to public record as a record accessible in public domain, processed or in control of a public body. Now, this one was very interesting for me because I was of the opinion that a few years ago, if I can find information on Facebook, on Google, then that's not personal information. I mean, I have access to it. It's for the public. And the Act is actually very clear on that. Google and Facebook is not a public body. So let's say I obtain information, personal information of a friend that posted it on Facebook. Can I use that? No. I actually need to go back to that friend and say, friend, I want to use your information. Do you give your consent? So be very careful. All information that you can find on these search engines, it's not public bodies in terms of the Act. And then pre-authorization, I did mention, we actually need to get approval from the information regulator if we want to do criminal checks on potential employees. If you're going to use information like children's information and you're going to do cross-border. And then also all those special type of information is also important to get approval for it. So it's a form that you need to fill in and submit to the information regulator. So even in your personal life, or let's say you work for a certain company, make sure that you actually have approval to process certain information. Okay, so what is personal information? There's quite a lot of things, and I'm quickly going to put it onto the screen. Please have a look out for it, quickly read through it, because it's actually a very, very wide definition. But the one that I'm specifically going to focus on is the one of special personal information. So a child's information is special. It's race, trade unions, membership, criminal behavior, your health. All of that is personal information, special personal information. So what does it mean to process information? And as I mentioned, we said that you can collect it, you can use it, you can store it, you can disseminate it, you can distract it, and also information or examples of personal information is also information stored on databases. And now I'm also talking about those databases that we've been compiling for quite a few years. Address books, I don't know if people still use it, but that's, for example, a printed address book is personal information. Payroll systems, and also then CCTV, that's a very interesting thing. That is also personal information. So when you enter certain buildings, etc., you'll notice outside they'll have a big notice saying, yes, you're entering now the premises. There is CCTV because they're actually informing you of it. But that process of personal information, by accessing the premises, you're actually giving us consent to have that. So you can do any of those activities, but it can only be processed upon consent. And then also if you need to conclude a performance in terms of a contract, and then if you have a legitimate interest. And then also proper performance of a public law duty by a public body. So we can't say to SARS, you've got my personal information, please delete it. Yes, I would also love for SARS to delete my personal information, but they need to have your personal information to process it in order to fulfill a public law duty. And then if it's necessary to pursue the legitimate interest of the responsible party or third party to whom the information is supplied. So I'm quickly going to just mention all the conditions in terms of lawful processing. Processing limitations. So you can't just process from A to B to C. You must have the relevant approval consent. It must be adequate. It must be relevant, and it mustn't be excessive. Excessive is very interesting. So I can't obtain information from you because it's nice to have. It really needs to be adequate and relevant, because as soon as you compile excessive information, you actually have a bigger responsibility to safeguard that information. And then accountability, purpose specification, further processing limitation. I can't obtain your information for a certain activity and process it, and then keep it, and then in a few months' time, I'm going to process it again. No, I need to have approval for specific activities, and then after that, I need to destroy your information. So now I'm talking about information that's not required by a law that needs to be stored. For example, SARS, financial information, employee information, they actually require us to store it for 5 years, etc. So it doesn't fall under those requirements. But if I get your consent that I'm going to process it today for a webinar, I can't use your information in 8 months' time for something else. So to keep information is no longer a nice to have. Information must be from quality, it must be accurate, not misleading. And then we need to be very open in terms of data processing. So you'll find a majority of companies now have T's and C's, and they have the privacy policy statement, etc. So have a look at. And yes, I know we don't click on it, we don't read it, but do yourself a favor and look at those websites, for example, you're accessing. Are their privacy policy updated? Do they actually comply with POPIA? It's also a very, very good. And then important, we need the data subjects participation. It's very important. I think our time is up. So from my side, key takeaways. You as a data subject has got a lot of rights in terms of POPIA. Make sure you know them. Follow the information regulator and what they do, and read articles in newspapers. But more important, stand on those rights. You know, if you've got a right to say, no, don't use my information, don't process it, etc. And then that's it. I don't know if there's anybody who has a question we can
Elsa?
discuss. Yes.
This is non-speaking.
Yes. Ma'am.
I received a question from a person who's unable to pose it on the chat group. It's Mario
Okay.
Lanteri, and he's
Yes.
asking, how is it possible that since POPIA came into effect, I am suddenly receiving regular calls to sell me help in trading on the stock exchange, and the insistent callers are not in South Africa but route their calls through a local cell number? When I ask them where they got my details, they say I must have clicked on a banner or from social media. Neither of these options are possible.
So, and that is a question that my husband asks every time when he answers those calls. Where did they get my information? Is POPIA effective? So that is a very, very quick, good question. And yes, you don't have to answer those calls, and you can reject them. You can ask them where they get your information, and other parties in other countries need to be POPIA compliant, and they're very smart to route it through other numbers. I mean, I've received them as well, and these type of examples we need to report to the information regulator. Do go into their website and post that, because it's very important that we need to stop these companies doing it. They have no right. And yes, for future, please make extra sure, especially when you click on the cookies. They, in their the privacy policies, they sometimes then allow, especially with certain analytics, well, it can be Google Analytics and Adobe Analytics, you actually then give consent that they use that information for marketing purposes, etc. So please be careful. Don't just accept cookies or accept, that they can use your personal information. Go into those statements and make sure that you know what they're doing with your information. I think it's going to take time, because if you've consented, let's say last year or 2 years ago, you need to actually know that you've given consent before POPIA. So it's going to take time that those consents are not applicable anymore, etc. So please make sure that what you consent for, that you know what you're consenting for. I think it's going to take time still.
Thank you. I see that Roy and Lynn Atkins' hand is up. I'm not sure. Roy and Lynn, would you like to ask a question?
Is it unmuted?
Yes, it's unmuted.
Thank you.
I wanted to know regarding telemarketing. I was phoned up by My Way. They knew where I lived. They knew what house I had. They knew what car I drive. and they wanted to know what my current insurance premium was, which I refused to tell them. But are they allowed to ask what the competition is actually charging you?
I mean, no, they can't. And what you need to do immediately, you need to ask them, because they say always, remember, our calls are recorded. Please specifically ask them to delete your information. You don't want them to process your information. You're happy with your service provider, etc. Then they can't give you that call again. So, and they can't just ask competitors, amounts unless they ask it from you. You can then provide it, but very quickly stop the engagement. Say it's recorded, so please make sure that you delete my information. Otherwise, they will continue and they're going to keep on having your information. I think if we're not going to start making sure that they delete it, they're going to have it somewhere in the system until you request that it gets deleted. But yeah, no, they're not supposed to have that information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And also be careful in terms of, especially when companies belong to other companies, so subsidiaries, then you usually consent that they can provide your information to a subsidiary. And that is where the issue comes in. Don't give approval for that, because then a MyWay may be belonging to another company, then phone you because you gave consent at one stage for that direct marketing.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And then also ask if they have proof of your consent that they can have your information. Challenge them, because they need to stop using our information if they don't have consent. And then report them. I think it's very, very important. Yes, we don't have time, but do that.
I asked them to send me an email and they refused. So
then you need to tell them, I'm going to report you to the information regulator. Let's see if that's going to work. But yeah, they need to stop with these calls. It feels like since July, it's just worse than other years.
Okay, thanks so much. That's all.
Okay, so if that was then the last question. Elsa?
Yes, I think it's the last question, and then nothing more from my side. Thank you so much, everybody, that you stayed and listened. I know the rugby is now coming up, so I don't want to keep anybody longer.
Thank you very much for sharing your valuable experience and expertise with us. It's really a much talked about topic, and I'm sure that there's a lot of empowerment that came through now, and a lot of other questions which I can think of that I'll pose to you later. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time.
Only a pleasure, and feel free to ask me anytime.
Thank you. Okay, you're welcome to leave the meeting. We are going over to a more informal discussion now between the MSers and our patient group. So anybody who would like to leave is welcome to do that now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Much appreciated, Sheila. We really appreciate the opportunity and your involvement with Multiple Sclerosis South Africa. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so whoever wanted to leave is, I think we're now going over to the next little bit of our discussion. I'm going to ask Christelle Tauter to switch on her video and unmute herself. There you go. And I would like to share an introduction. What is on my screen now?
Yeah, it says Christelle Tauter.
Okay, cool. Christelle, I wish to introduce you as the person who were in a high-flying corporate job, but 6 years ago you left that world of working. You were medically boarded, and after already living with MS for 15 years, your illustrious career of 18 years in recruitment included sourcing of talent and operational management, training and quality insurance came to an end. You really used extensive DMT interventions, which did not work for you at the time, and you underwent an HSCT, hematopoietic stem cell transplant. And 6 years later, after the transplant, you are here to relay your story, and we are interested to know what happened 6 years later. Over to you, Christelle.
Thank you, Non. Okay, I'm going to keep it brief. I'm sure many people want to run to the rugby, so I'll talk quickly. 6 years ago, I had the HSCT, which is the stem cell transplant. I was on disease-modifying treatment. I was on Avonex for 2 years. Then I was on Rebirth for about 3 years. Then I used the Vantrone. And then in 2015, I decided, well, nothing is really working. I didn't respond well to those medicines. So I decided I'm taking the opportunity. I'm going to go for the stem cell transplant. And like the doctor said, in South Africa, our medical aids don't pay for it. So with the help of my friends, we went into serious fundraising and we raised the funds and I had the treatment. It took about a month in the hospital, and now 6 years later, important, I think, to say, before I went, I was already in a wheelchair. After I came out, I am still in a wheelchair. So it didn't make me miraculously now all of a sudden walk or anything like that. But in 6 years after the treatment, I've had no progression. And in 2 instances, I can say, here's the proof, is that every year afterwards, for 6 years now, I've had an MRI and it showed no progression. And also in my physical body, I can say that it's really no progression. So that was that. And for me, I would do the stem cell transplant again. It's tough. It's a tough treatment, but I would definitely do it again. In hindsight, I wish I did it before I was in the wheelchair, when I could still walk. Then maybe today I could still walk. But, you know, this is the way we progress and the decisions that we make. I think what's important to say is the last discussion I had with my neurologist now about 2 weeks ago with my last MRI is we discussed that maybe today, 6 years later, we wouldn't have done the stem cell transplant because now there's a lot more medication available. And I hate to say in my day because it makes me sound really old, but I am old. But there were only interferons available in my day. Now there's so much more medications available, and really when someone is diagnosed and they use these treatments, the chances that you won't progress is really good. And it's not to say if I didn't respond to interferons, you won't. So, but for me, stem cell transplant was the right decision. Any questions? Does that cover what you wanted me to say? I mean, I was, like Non said, in a corporate world. I was with the same company for 18 years, never stagnant. I was in 7 different positions, and it was tough to be medically boarded. And it's almost like you feel like you lose your significance. But in hindsight, also, I thought I'd go for a stem cell transplant, then go back to work afterwards. you don't recover from that so quickly. It's a tough ride. So yeah, now I fill my life with other things. But yeah, Non, does that cover what you wanted me to say?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's exactly what we wanted to tell, because there are so many questions that I have to deal with in terms of HSCT, and people always ask me, is Christelle better now? And that covers what that answer is all about. I encourage anybody to unmute themselves and let's have a discussion. You're welcome to talk about it. Any other questions you want? Let's talk about it now. We have some 5 minutes for social interaction. So you're welcome to talk and unmute and show your videos. Yeah, you're welcome. Seems like people are a bit scared to do
No,
that.
maybe it's good. Maybe they're very happy to hear that now with new medications, there's new revived hope.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, you're also welcome, everybody. If you would like to comment on the meeting, did it conform to your expectation? How was Dr. Shamley? Any comments is welcomed. Ferdi, I see you've put your hand up. If you unmute yourself, then you can quickly ask your question. Ferdi, you had your hand up. Was it just an accident? Okay, anybody else? Okay, it seems like we've come to the end of our meeting then. I wish to thank everybody that helped. Christelle for your little talk, for Elise for helping us in the beginning, for Helga to help us to mute and unvideo people, and everything went well, I'm glad to say. So I hope everybody's going to enjoy the rugby. And that's the end of that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming along. You're welcome, Nadine.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.